about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions and conversation, because I know when it comes to the Civil War, unlike some historical topics, a lot of people have questions and a lot of people have opinions, and perhaps that's especially true for those of you in Talbot County, Maryland, right now. So hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. So 160 years ago this month, America was in turmoil over, if you can believe this, the results of a presidential election. I know it seems far-fetched. Millions of voters were celebrating their candidate's decisive victory and eagerly anticipating his inauguration, while millions of other voters were denouncing the outcome and swearing that they would never accept it. And millions of Black Americans, nearly all of them forbidden by law to vote, anxiously awaited events that might have profound consequences for their lives and for their rights. And in fact, although mainstream historians now agree, and quite rightly so, that the Civil War was fundamentally a contest over slavery, I think we've lost sight of the war's proximate cause in 1860-61, which is a substantial number of Americans refused to accept the results of a presidential election. And as we look to the Civil War for lessons for today, perhaps that's something that's very worth bearing in mind. So in November 1860, very few people on either side could have predicted just how vast the effects of that refusal to accept an election would be. And that was certainly true on the Eastern Shore as it was everywhere else. One newspaper editor in Talbot County, as he tried to soothe the ruffled feathers of local whites upset over Lincoln's election, reassured them by saying that even with an anti-slavery Republican in the presidency, the slave system in America couldn't possibly be abolished for perhaps centuries to come. Those were his words, for perhaps centuries to come. And nor, of course, could many people on the Eastern Shore or anywhere else envision a war in which nearly 1 million people would die. And I think it's important to, I was struck when I saw that newspaper editorial. So many people today, when they think about the Civil War, when they think about the emancipation of African Americans, they think somehow that these were things that were foreordained, that slavery was going to be on the way out anyway, that everybody knew in 1860-61 that it was doomed. And that certainly was not the case, even on the Eastern Shore, where in some senses it was already under threat as the whites saw it. So tonight I'm going to try to shed some light on the war by telling the stories of 4 people, actually 3 stories of 4 people, since 2 of them were a married couple whose stories I will combine. So these stories of 4 people from the Eastern Shore whose lives were changed by the conflict. Each of them is a person with whom I've come to know through some personal connections, and not just the usual scholarly research kinds of connections. Their stories are all very different from one another, but I think that together they tell something about the dramas and complexities of the war as it was experienced in this dramatic and complicated part of the country. 2 of these people were white and from elite family backgrounds. 2 of them were Black, born into slavery and poverty. I'm going to share their stories not in order of importance, but in the order that I think makes the most sense in terms of narrating the overall drama of how the conflict played out here in our area. And while there weren't any military battles fought here on the Eastern Shore, the Civil War was very much a struggle for those who lived here, much as it was for Americans throughout the country. And it was a struggle here with life or death stakes. There are a lot of cliches about the Civil War, of course, in general in America. There have been lots of cliches forming since the conflict itself. And there are some cliches that are specific to Maryland. Now, one of the cliches, perhaps the most commonly heard one, is that Maryland really was a pro-Confederate state that was just kept in the Union at the point of bayonets and would have seceded if Lincoln and his goons had allowed it to. That's not true. I'll tell you more of the story, and I hope you'll get a sense of how complicated that was tonight. As a historian, I'm a believer in particularity and specificity. And the Civil War is also a moment in history that tends to get generalized a lot. There are always those temptations to fit human beings into categories. to categorize people living in 1861 to 1865 as being blue or gray, as being black or white, free or enslaved. But in fact, the experiences of people in the 1860s were 30 million different experiences for the 30 million Americans, 4 million of whom were enslaved. And I think that telling some of those specific stories, giving a sense of those complications of their lives, is something that we really we owe to those people. In the same way that each of our lives is ruled by 1,000 different contingencies and questions and uncertainties and prejudices and influences and people. I think that we have to afford the same distinction to people in the past when we talk about their experiences, to not fit them into categories, but try to get into the specifics of their lives, and through those particularities, perhaps understand some of the generalities more clearly as well. So I wanted to start, well, first of all, this map that I'm showing you, which I really, really love. This is a map that was actually done in 1861, even though it looks like a satellite map. Of course, they didn't have satellites in 1861, nor did they have hot air balloons that could go quite that high. But this is an artist's imagining, basically, of, as you can see, the title of the map is The Seat of War. So this is at the very outbreak of the Civil War, before the battles were taking place. They were imagining where this conflict was really going to play itself out. And you can see that the Chesapeake was central. People really thought that this was where the Civil War was going to unfold. And while the Eastern Shore isn't exactly central, you can see what's really at the center is the area around Washington, D.C. It's not exactly peripheral either. You can even see, you can't see Chestertown on this map, but you can see Kent Island, you can see Easton, you can even see Oxford if you really squint down there. So this is an area that Americans knew, and that people on the Eastern Shore knew was central to the history that was unfolding. The first of the three stories I'm going to share with you begins with a tale of discovery. Now, as a teacher here at Washington College, I like to take my students exploring through this incredibly rich historic area. There's really nothing like it. You can get a sense of history that you can't get by sitting and reading books. When you go out and you walk the trails where history happened, when you explore old houses and villages, when you do oral histories with local folks whose family legacies stretch back for generations. It's just an incredible richness that we have as our heritage here.
Yeah, and that's the
One of my favorite places is an old house in Queen Anne's County called Poplar Grove, which is still in the hands of a family whose ancestors have owned it for some 13 generations since the 1660s. And I like taking my students there in one of the college minibuses, because I'm that kind of teacher who drives the minibus. And as we turn off of Spaniard Neck Road north of Centerville and we go onto this long dirt driveway, I tell them, ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts. We are now leaving the 21st century. So we get out of the bus, we see this old kind of homely, restored and re-restored and renovated and re-renovated, early Georgian and then Victorianized and then re-Georgianized house. We explore it. We go into the family cemetery next to the house and pay our respects to some of the dead residents. And we also talk to some of their living descendants who are lovely people, the Wood family, descendants of the Emery family of Poplar Grove and others, who are really lovely people and who are very generous about sharing their history with us. And I think actually the person who's standing in the foreground of the group of students is on this call, Sheila Austrian, who is an alumna of Washington College and whose name I saw a few minutes ago in the audience for this call. And this is a picture taken the first time that I ever visited Poplar Grove with students in 2003. So I've been going there with students for a while. But the particularly momentous visit that I made to Poplar Grove was a dozen years ago in 2008, when I went with a group of students and we talked with the family about a story that we'd heard a little bit of before, but kind of made a particular impression this time. It's a story about a family mystery whose details had become fuzzy over the years. According to the family's oral tradition, at the start of the Civil War, there had been an ancestor, a member of the Emory family, who had had some sort of a conflict over which side to join and might have switched sides more than once. Might have joined the Union, the Confederacy, switched back to the Union, or maybe it was vice versa. The details had become hazy, but the family knew that this had happened and that there had been some sort of drama involving it. Now, one of my students in particular heard this story and became fascinated by it. He was also fascinated by what we'd seen in the attic of the house. Now, in the attic in those days, they've since been removed, but in the attic in those days were thousands of pages of family papers. You can see a photo here of just a smattering of those papers, which, as you can see, were stored according to the best archival practices of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Namely, they were stuffed into old peach baskets and lard cans and steamer trunks and just sort of jammed in willy-nilly. Eventually, when we went through these papers, we would discover that there were more than 30,000 pages of documents ranging from these land deeds from the 1600s all the way up to somebody's credit card statements and canceled checks from the 1970s and 1980s. This student of mine had seen those papers in the attic, and he said, I'd really like to find out what really happened with this family. What's the truth behind that family story at the start of the Civil War with this family member who may have changed sides more than once? And I'm going to dig through the papers up in the attic, and I'm going to find that story, and I'm going to write about it as the term paper for my class this semester. So the student was a freshman at the time. His name was Jim Shellberg, a fantastic, fantastic student who became a Starr student at Washington College and had big intellectual ambitions and big intellectual capabilities. But sometimes as a teacher, you have to encourage your students to dream big, and sometimes you have to encourage them to scale down a little bit. So I said, Jim, I think I have to encourage you to scale down here because there's so many pages up in the attic of documents. Your term paper is due in 2 weeks. There's probably no way that you can find this story in that short amount of time and write about it. And he said, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway, and I want you to help me. So I said, okay, Jim, I'll spend a few hours with you going through the papers, and we'll see what I can find. We'll see what we can find. Probably won't find the full story, but maybe we'll find something else that you can write your term paper about. So anyway, we came back a couple of days later, just Jim and I. We started digging around through the papers, and it turned out that one of the things that the family gave us was this bundle of documents that's labeled, as you perhaps can see here, correspondence between Major W.H. Emory and wife regarding his resignation from the U.S. Army 1861. So here was this story right here in this big, thick bundle of papers. And when I saw it, I was just sort of dumbstruck. And I turned to Jim, my student, and I said, Jim, well, you should know that it's not always this easy. But on this occasion, it was. And in fact, we undid those ribbons, as you can see, those tightly tied silk ribbons that probably hadn't been undone in a century and a half. And inside, we found the story of this man, Major William Hemsley Emory. Major Emory was born in 1811, one of 11 children at Poplar Grove, a 600-acre farm on the Chester River between Centerville and Chestertown, worked by several dozen enslaved laborers who made his family quite wealthy. In fact, one of his first memories as a little boy, as a 3-year-old, was being carried in the arms of his African-American nursemaid down to the Chester River to see a British warship sailing past during the War of 1812. his first military experience, but hardly the last, when he was 3 years old. Major Emory, or William Emory, attended Washington College, which was an interesting story I won't go into all the salacious details of. Suffice to say, he attended until one day when he happened to see the president of Washington College, a distinguished Episcopal clergyman named the Reverend Dr. Timothy Close, caught in a compromising position with the college milkmaid, which caused a scandal, which resulted in him being hastily withdrawn by his father from Washington College and sent as a teenage cadet to West Point. So through this encounter, this X-rated encounter, began a very distinguished American military career. And by the time the Civil War began in 1861, Emory had been serving under the Stars and Stripes since he was a teenager for nearly 40 years. And he'd served the Stars and Stripes very well. He was known among his brother officers as Bold Emory, kind of a lovely nickname if you're going to have a nickname among your friends, Bold Emory. And he'd fought with distinction in the Seminole Wars and in the war between the United States and Mexico. He'd helped bring California into the Union. And at the end of the war, as a military engineer, he mapped the new international border between the United States and Mexico. So when the Civil War began, he was commanding, this is his wife here, Matilda, who was his correspondent in those letters that I just showed you. When the war began, he was commanding a US garrison at Fort Washita, which was way out in Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma. So he was very, very far from what was called the seat of war. He was very far from the center of the action. And as he was out there in Oklahoma, he was processing all of this news from back east, trying to figure out what was going on and what he should do. And it was very confusing for him. Obviously, he had many reasons to stay loyal to the Union, not just patriotism, but the investment of this entire lifetime, this lifelong military career. But in the correspondence with his wife, as I read through it for the first time with my student 12 years ago, what really struck me the most were the very personal considerations that he was bringing to bear. It wasn't really just about these high-flown ideals for Major Emory and Mrs. Emory. There were ties of friendship and family. One of his closest friends, going all the way back to West Point, was Jefferson Davis. And in fact, his teenage son, Thomas, was living with the Davis family in 1861 while attending medical school. On the other hand, his wife, Matilda, was a Yankee. Like me, she was a Yankee from Philadelphia. There are a few of us here on the Eastern Shore. But Matilda was actually even more of a Philadelphia Yankee than I am, because she was a direct descendant of Benjamin Franklin, and you don't get much more Yankee from Philadelphia than that. So there was this strong tie to the North. Then there was the question of slavery. Now, William H. Emory himself was no ideologue on slavery. At least he would later claim that he was never a great fan of the slave system. But his brother back in Queen Anne's County, his brother who was keeping the plantation going, was, and of course the family fortune depended on the labor of enslaved men, women, and children. So there was that not small financial consideration and not small consideration of preserving the system of white supremacy on which society on the Eastern Shore depended. But ultimately it came down to personal ambition as well. Should he cast his lot with this new American republic, or perhaps become a founding father of the Confederate States of America, perhaps the same kind of winning gamble that his grandparents' generation had experienced during the American Revolution. Or if he did that, might he end up strung up from a gallows as a traitor? It was not an easy decision. But through it all, he kept his ear to the ground and waited to see what Maryland was going to do. And throughout the crisis, the news seemed to suggest that Maryland was going to secede. After all, it was a slave state that was traditionally considered to be Southern culturally and politically. So finally, as he pondered this, Major Emory decided that he just couldn't join the rebellion against his nation, couldn't lift his sword against the Stars and Stripes, but neither could he lift his sword against his native state if it came to that. So what he did, like not a few other Marylanders, was he tried to sort of walk a thin line. He drafted a letter of resignation to the War Department. He sent it to his brother back in Maryland, and he wrote a letter with it in which he said, put this in the mail if and when, and only if and when, Maryland secedes from the Union. So as we know, Maryland did not secede from the Union during that secession winter of 1860-61. And why didn't it? Well, part of the reason I think can be conveyed by looking again at this map I showed you a few minutes ago. Now, Marylanders were more divided over the Civil War than popular memory often suggests. While Maryland certainly did not go for Abraham Lincoln in the presidential contest, it did have some Lincoln voters, especially in Baltimore and in Western Maryland. There were some supporters of the Republicans. But more importantly, Marylanders were then, as they are now, a pretty practical group of people. Maybe all people are practical groups of people, but you kind of had to be if you were a Marylander, because you knew, as this map suggests, that your area, your home, was going to be right in the middle of the action. You were going to be between the two warring nations of the United States and the Confederate States. They knew that they would immediately be overrun if they joined the Union, if they joined the Confederacy rather, for simple geographical reasons. Namely, you can see that in this map, Virginia has this nice geographical boundary of the Potomac River to defend itself behind. Maryland has no such boundary. Maryland's boundary was the purely artificial Mason-Dixon line, which was no boundary at all, and which couldn't possibly be defended against the Union armies. So even if Maryland seceded, they would be looking at immediately being occupied territory by the Union. They also decided, and this is something that might seem counterintuitive, but they decided that slavery would be safer within the Union than without it, in the words of one Maryland slaveholder. They already knew from decades of experience, these Maryland whites, what it meant to live right on the Mason-Dixon line, right in an area where basically an enslaved person, if they could steal away and seize their freedom by going just a few dozen miles up the road to Pennsylvania, they might be able to escape for good and thus liberate themselves and to deprive their masters of their services and the considerable capital investment, awful as it is to frame in these terms, that each of those men and women and children represented. There was something that protected slaveholders, of course, in Maryland and elsewhere in the South, and that was the fugitive slave laws that said that if you were an enslaved person who escaped above the Mason-Dixon line, the full force of US law, including the federal Constitution, was behind capturing you and returning you to your owners no matter where you were in the North. However, Marylanders knew that if they announced that they were seceding from the Union, that law would no longer hold true for them, and they very rightly feared that enslaved people could simply escape en masse. So that's part of why Maryland did not ultimately vote to secede. Okay, so what happened with Major Emory, however? So he, as I told you, he decided to send this letter to ask his brother not to put it in the mail unless Maryland left the Union. Well, guess what happened? His brother put it in the mail anyway. His brother was a major Confederate sympathizer in Queen Anne's County, and he was a little bit overeager, wished that Maryland was going to cast its lot with the Confederacy. And before Major Emory knew it, it had been submitted to Washington, and it had been accepted by the War Department. Now, by this point, poor Major Emory actually had already been appointed a major general in the Union Army. He had this appointment pending. He had already even taken the field against secessionist troops out in Indian Territory. captured the first Confederate prisoners of the entire Civil War. So he rushed to Washington. His wife Matilda rushed to the War Department at the White House. After months of lobbying, he was finally grudgingly reinstated by the Lincoln administration. But as you can see in this newspaper editorial from Washington, already he was under a cloud of suspicion. This newspaper editor says is probably too late, for by his own act, he is loyal only when Maryland is loyal, and the Army needs no such men. That was more or less the attitude of the U.S. Army, which grudgingly let him back in, but only gave him these sort of subordinate appointments. He never rose above the rank of colonel in the regular army throughout the war, even though he served gallantly, fought in the Shenandoah campaign under the great General Philip Sheridan. But if it hadn't been for that letter that he wrote in 1861 and that his brother dropped in the mail, given his eminence before the war, he probably would have become one of the great Union commanders of the Civil War from right here on the Eastern Shore. But he certainly was much more distinguished when the war began than men like Grant, who grew much more distinguished as the year went on. But Major Emory did not. As interesting as what happened with him is the story of the rest of his family, the rest of the Emory family from Poplar Grove. Two of his sons also fought in the Civil War. Here they are on the left, Campbell Dallas Emory, who fought in the Union Army. And not only did he fight in the Union Army, but he fought as an aide-de-camp to General George Meade, the hero victor of the Battle of Gettysburg. So he was pretty solidly embedded in the Union Army indeed. On the right is his slightly younger son, Thomas Emory, who not only served the Confederacy, but actually served as assistant surgeon aboard the Confederate States ship Florida, which was one of the most famous naval raiders of the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. And so in 1864, this young man, when the Florida was captured by the Union Navy, was actually marched in shackles through the streets of Washington, D.C., being jeered at by crowds, along with the other officers and crew of the CSS Florida. Imagine that happening to someone whose father was commanding Union forces in the field at the time. Two of Emory's brothers fought for the Confederacy as well. One of whom, without going into his whole story, one of whom actually was such a Confederate dead ender that he actually was with Jefferson Davis. He was an officer who accompanied Jefferson Davis after Richmond fell and Jefferson Davis was fleeing in disguise into the Deep South. And this guy, Frederick Emory, Captain Frederick Emory, was actually given a significant portion of gold from the Confederate treasury to entrust to his care. And perhaps not surprisingly, that gold was never seen again when Emory kind of vanished into the forests of Florida. It's unknown what happened with it. He died in poverty and obscurity in a Confederate nursing home in the 1890s. So that story of the Emory shows that here on the Eastern Shore, the Civil War, which has so often been metaphorically called a contest of brother against brother, literally was a contest not just of brothers against brothers, but fathers against sons, and a story in which all of these people were motivated by very different and very complicated reasons that go beyond what you might think. So my story now is going to shift to the second of my three tales, goes to another house divided. I'm sorry, this is the Confederate States, Florida there. Away from the house divided of Poplar Grove and to another house divided, which is a house that's actually even nearer and dearer to my heart than Poplar Grove is, because it happens to be the house where I've lived for the past 17 years. It's my house in Centerville, Maryland. When I first moved to the Eastern Shore from Washington, as a historian, of course, I was excited to be moving into a house that was almost 200 years old, now well over 200 years old, and immediately wanted to find out all of the stories behind this place where I was living. And I soon found that it had some very exciting stories to it indeed. And I'm going to share a couple of those with you. One of them is the story of the next of our three characters, who is this man, Judge Richard Bennett Carmichael. Judge Carmichael, mild-mannered looking fellow though he was in this picture, was at the center of a very dramatic story. It's a story that unfolded not in my house in Centerville, which is where Judge Carmichael was born on Christmas Day in 1807, where he grew up and where he had his law office as a young man. But rather it's a drama that played out where many of you are in Talbot County. In fact, at the Talbot County Courthouse, where on May 24th, 1862, Judge Carmichael was presiding over a case, presiding over a grand jury, in fact, not a case, but a grand jury proceeding, when 125 blue uniformed soldiers surrounded the courthouse. And all of Easton waited expectantly to see the drama that was going to unfold. And a drama that they had actually been anticipating, and that Judge Carmichael himself had been anticipating would happen for weeks, if not months. So why was this happening? Why had these dozens of Union soldiers armed to the teeth disembarked in this sleepy little Eastern Shore county town? Well, it was because of this. It was because of this charge to the grand jury that Judge Carmichael was delivering. Judge Carmichael, who was a staunch defender of slavery, he had been very active in the local movement to oppose the Underground Railroad on the Eastern Shore. As a member of Congress, he had been a great supporter of Andrew Jackson. He had been very involved through the 1850s in bolstering the pro-slavery cause in Maryland. He had decided that the civil rights, ironically enough, the civil rights of Maryland whites were being infringed upon by the Lincoln administration. The Lincoln administration had sent in soldiers to make arrests of suspected secessionists on the Eastern Shore. And as Judge Carmichael says in this document, as he told the jury, violent and dangerous injuries have been committed upon your citizens, while the process of law has been forbidden to reach the offender. Arrests have been made utterly groundless, as it turned out, but whether without cause or not, by persons having no legal competency to make arrests and without warrant of law or process from legal authority. So what Judge Carmichael wanted the jury to do, in short, was to actually bring criminal charges against these Union soldiers who were coming over and arresting the citizens of the Eastern Shore. And he was in the process of telling them to do this, as he had already done in Queen Anne's County and in Kent County, when soldiers surrounded the Talbot County Courthouse. And what happened next, this is a dramatic view done by a later artist. What happened next was described in detail in contemporary accounts. The leader of the armed men, Provost Marshal James McPhail, who had come over from Baltimore, Provost Marshal of Maryland, announced, "Sir, you are under arrest." And Judge Carmichael said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am Provost Marshal McPhail of the United States Army." And Judge Carmichael said, "I do not recognize your authority." And Provost Marshal McPhail said, "Then I shall have to do this by force." Judge Carmichael said, "We shall see about that." And then he called for the sheriff to come and arrest the provost marshal. So in effect, setting up a confrontation between federal authority and state authority right there in his own courtroom, or federal authority and county authority. With that, looking around the room, the judge realized that the sheriff and his deputy had conveniently decided to duck out and go to lunch at the time. The sheriff knew full well what was going to happen. The sheriff did not particularly want to end up in the midst of this confrontation. And so it turned out to be the Union soldiers against the judge. And the balding, bespectacled Judge Carmichael was no match for 125 armed Union troops. They came up, and as you can see, they grabbed the judge. The judge was a small but feisty man who kicked and fought. According to some accounts, one of the soldiers grabbed him by his bushy beard. In any event, it's agreed that they took their pistols and they started pistol whipping him over the head, The judge had approximately as much hair on his head as I have on mine, although he had more of a beard. And they very seriously injured him, and they dragged him unconscious and bleeding out of the courtroom through the streets of Easton and to their steamer, from which, and they departed from Easton and took him to Fort McHenry, where they threw him into Fort McHenry as a prisoner. This actually became headline news all over the country. It was on the front page of the New York Times a few days later, this wonderful headline, "Excitement in Maryland." Not a headline that we're used to seeing from the Eastern Shore in the New York Times necessarily very often. But Judge Carmichael became a hero to Marylanders and others in the South who believed that their civil rights were being trampled by the Lincoln administration. And in fact, the case became so prominent that it made its way all the way to Lincoln's desk. And today in Lincoln's papers in the Library of Congress, there are a large number of documents that deal with the Carmichael case, in which Lincoln himself reviewed the evidence, reviewed petitions from people both for and against Judge Carmichael, accusations against him, pleas for his release. And in this letter, one of the most interesting ones, Lincoln writes to a congressman from the Eastern Shore, John Crisfield, who had been writing, who was an ally of Lincoln's, been writing in sympathy with Judge Carmichael. And Lincoln, I think, sums up the case pretty well, where he refers to Judge Carmichael's attempt to find constitutional justification for his charge to the grand jury. And he says the judge was trying to keep, the judge was trying to help a little by giving the protection of law to those who were endeavoring to overthrow the supreme law, trying, if he could find a safe place for certain men to stand on the Constitution whilst they should stab it in another place. So Lincoln, with his characteristic ability to find that very descriptive figurative language, suggesting that Carmichael was trying to basically use the Constitution, the US Constitution, as leverage in order to stab the US Constitution. So Lincoln did not immediately release Judge Carmichael, who ended up then in Fort Delaware, an even more godforsaken spot than Fort McHenry was, and was finally released more than 6 months later, by which point he becomes seriously ill and incapacitated by the hardships of prison life. But he remained a hero to pro-Confederate Marylanders and others. He was featured in books like this one, American Bastille. He got an entire chapter, the story of his arrest. And you can see on the right, there's a dramatic depiction of the arrests that were going on in Maryland, and the finger that's ringing a bell, which is supposed to be a finger of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, ringing for an arrest warrant to be served. But Carmichael's allies in Maryland did give him one honor or one opportunity, which is that in 1867, when a constitutional convention was formed in Maryland, they chose him as the president of the Constitutional Convention to write a new constitution for Maryland. There was a constitutional convention in Maryland in 1867 because they were basically trying to throw out the Constitution of 1864, the Constitution that had abolished slavery, that had granted civil rights to African Americans as citizens of the state, and had been accomplished with the intervention, had been passed with the intervention of the Union government. In 1867, slaveholders like Carmichael and others gathered to try to undo that, to try to roll back protections for African American Marylanders, and they largely succeeded. And under Carmichael's direction, they wrote this constitution that actually, with many amendments, is still the constitution that's in force in Maryland today. I have to give Carmichael a little bit of credit for one thing that he did at this constitutional convention, and that has to do with the debate over reparations. Now, when I mention reparations for slavery in the current context, you may imagine one thing. You may imagine that it's the reparations that many people feel are owed to African Americans for the centuries of stolen labor exacted from their forefathers. When Carmichael and his comrades at the convention thought of reparations for slavery, they thought of reparations for them who, as they saw it, had had property confiscated that belonged to them, property being these enslaved people. And there was a debate over whether to write that into the Maryland Constitution. To Carmichael's credit, he actually helped to vote that down. He spoke, as you can see here, and spoke against there being reparations paid to slaveholders, not on the basis that there wasn't any legitimate right, but on the basis that he didn't think it was fair for white people who were non-slaveholders or who only owned one slave to have to reimburse through their tax dollars people like him who might have owned dozens or hundreds of slaves. So I don't know if Carmichael deserves huge credit for that or not, but I suppose as I look back on this man who lived decades of his life in my house, it's at least one redeeming feature. But the final story that I have to share, which is also a story from this same house divided, my house on the Eastern Shore, is a story that is perhaps the closest to my heart and that I find the most surprising and profound and perhaps also a very sad story as well. And it's the story of a couple who weren't famous like Major and later General Emory, like Judge and later Constitutional Convention President Carmichael, but rather a couple named Frank and Susan Laws. We don't actually have a picture of Frank and Susan Laws, unlike of Carmichael and Emory. In fact, in the earliest document I have of them, they don't even appear by name. They appear here in the US Census in 1860, not as people, but as property, the property of Augustus McCabe, Captain Augustus McCabe, who was a ship's captain on the Chesapeake and who owned my house in Centerville at that point. He bought it from the Carmichael family some years earlier. And you can see that there are a 28-year-old black man, that's what the M for male and the B for black mean, and then at the bottom, a 28-year-old black female. And they were noted without names, as was typical in the censuses at that point, as being the enslaved property of Captain McCabe. So we don't have their faces, but I do think it's important for them to be as vivid as all of the other people that I'm talking about tonight. So I think I'd like you to imagine them as these people. This is a family from the Eastern Shore, from Cecil County, actually, and that's a member of the US colored troops and his spouse during the Civil War. So you can picture their faces as I talk about Frank and Susan Laws. Now, their story was the last one of the stories that I'm telling tonight that I actually learned myself. I knew a little bit about them from some research that I had done about the history of my house. I'd found a document that said that Frank Laws was one of some 6,000 Black Marylanders who served in the US colored troops during the Civil War. I found this document from March of 1864 in which Captain McCabe actually manumitted him to serve in the Union Army. Now, this is something that, again, when you talk about reparations, slavery reparations in America, this is a form of reparations that's not widely known. There was a program in Maryland and elsewhere in the so-called border states where quote unquote loyal white slaveholders could emancipate their slaves, enlist them immediately in the Union Army, more or less going from one form of servitude to another, and in the process get paid a bounty by the state of Maryland, a $100 bounty, as you can see here. And often there would be a bounty eventually from the United States as well. So sometimes these slaveholders would earn as much as $200 or $300 for freeing their slaves and enlisting them in the US Army. And that was the case with Frank Laws. So I knew that he had been enlisted in the Union Army in March of 1864. I knew that he had been enlisted, as this document says, into the 39th Regiment of US Colored Troops, Company I, and I didn't know a whole lot about his life beyond that until just a couple of years ago, when I happened to find, searching around on ancestry.com, as I'm sure many of you have done as well, this intriguing but brief document. It's an index card for a pension file, a Civil War pension application file. And basically all it says is that there's a pension application in the National Archives for Francis Laws of the 39th US Colored Infantry that was submitted by his widow, whose name was Susan Laws, filing it from the state of New Jersey, and that this is the pension file number. Doesn't tell you anything else about what it is. But I was going to the National Archives not long after to do some research and decided to fill out a call slip and call this up, not knowing what I would get. Now, Civil War pension files can be very short or very long. Often they're very routine. Somebody simply submits an application and says that they served in thus and such a regiment. The federal pension clerks check that against their records, find that person's name in the muster roll, and start cutting checks to that person every month for the rest of their life. This under the pension system that started in the 1880s. However, African Americans often had a much more difficult time. They had a much more difficult time because often their names would change after slavery, after their service in the war. Often the records of their service weren't as good. And perhaps most of all, often these federal bureaucrats, these predominantly white federal bureaucrats, were much less likely to believe their claims and much more likely to be suspicious of their actual service in the war. So ironically enough, this means that sometimes African-American Civil War pension records could be incredibly rich and complete because they had to submit all kinds of documents to prove their service. And when I called up the Laws family, Frank and Susan Laws file, that turned out to be the case. They brought me a big fat file with well over 100 pages in it, with this as its cover sheet. And in it, there was just a wealth of testimony about the lives of these two people, their relatives, their neighbors, the life and the family of their former master, Captain McCabe, and many other people involved with their story. I won't go into all of the details, but as I sat there paging through it at the National Archives, it was just one of the most remarkable experiences I've ever had as a historian, as it brought to life for me these people who spent many years long ago in the very same rooms that I know so well today, and reading these stories that told a story of love and war and slavery and freedom. As it turned out, Frank and Susan, and the application actually was filed by Susan, and here is her mark. You can see she signed with an X. She never learned to read and write, but she signed with an X. Frank and Susan were brought up, they were born on different farms near Centerville, where they were enslaved to different masters. And when they were very small children, one master died and the other went bankrupt. And both children were in danger of being, as Susan later put it, sold into Georgia. But as she recounted, Captain McCabe purchased them because she said he was opposed to slaves being separated from their families. Both of them were then about 5 years old. He brought them to live in his house, in what's now my house, and they grew up together in his household, probably sleeping in the servant's garret in what's now my attic. And Susan worked cooking meals for the other enslaved people in the house. Then the war came. And as I said, Frank was emancipated in 1864 by his master and joined the US Colored Infantry. Just a few months later, he ended up in the midst of one of the most dramatic moments of the Civil War. He, first of all, something happened that was maybe not dramatic, but dramatic for him. He sprained his ankle while he was working for the Union Army. This is something that was actually pretty common among soldiers in the US colored troops. When you read the records of their service, they would have these severe injuries that came from hard labor, because they were often the ones who were assigned to do this really intense work, digging trenches, burying the dead with shoddy equipment that white soldiers in the Union Army weren't given to do. So he injured himself already doing manual labor. But he was released from a Union Army hospital just in time to rejoin his colleagues and experience the Battle of Petersburg, and particularly to serve on July 30th, 1864, when he was wounded at one of the most famous engagements of the latter part of the Civil War, the Battle of the Crater. For those of you who might not know about the Battle of the Crater, it happened when Grant's army was besieging Lee's army, decided to try to break the Confederate lines by tunneling underneath the Confederate trenches, packing it full of gunpowder, and setting off a gigantic explosion that would blow a hole in the Confederate defenses through which the Union troops could march. They in fact did this. Hundreds of Confederate soldiers were killed. But in the process, what they didn't count on was that they would create this gigantic crater. And when the troops with US colored troops in the vanguard were sent marching into this crater, they immediately found themselves being shot by the Confederates like fish in the barrel, trapped at the bottom of this enormous pit of dirt. And what was supposed to be a Union triumph and breakthrough turned into a Union disaster. The 39th US colored troops were right in the thick of it. They suffered very heavy casualties, more than almost any other regiment in that battle. Some of them were bayoneted by the Confederates in cold blood, murdered after they had surrendered, or while they still lay wounded in the field. Sadly common behavior for the Confederates fighting Black troops. Luckily, Frank Laws himself escaped that fate. And I found no conclusive description of what happened to him at Petersburg, but he ended up pretty quickly back in the Union Army hospitals, where he spent months. His injury and his sprained ankle soon gave way to some sort of a disease. And I'll tell you in a few minutes what I think that disease was, that he contracted while he was hospitalized. And he was present in the hospitals for most of the next year. He petitioned to be released from the Union Army. He was pronounced to be basically functionally disabled. Even after the doctors pronounced him functionally disabled, he wasn't released. He was sent back into the ranks. He was present at the great surrender of the Southern armies to General Sherman in North Carolina in April of 1865 after Appomattox. And he remained in the Union Army for another 6 months. In the pension application that I found, Susan, his widow, would describe very dramatically one chilly night late in 1865, not long before Christmas, when Frank came home, as she said, right to Captain McCabe's. And I like to imagine him, I can imagine him standing there in this faded blue uniform, right there at the door of my house. And she described in her affidavit, she said, Frank and I and all of us who had been living there were freed by Mr. Lincoln's proclamation, but kept right on living with Captain McCabe. So their lives that in some ways have been changed dramatically by the Civil War, in some ways didn't change at all. And they remained probably as servants in Captain McCabe's house. Both of them were widowed at that point. They weren't yet married to one another when the war ended. They had been married to other people. They'd been widowed and lost their spouses. But somehow in the next couple of years, romance bloomed between these two people who had spent most of their lives growing up together. And I like to try to imagine the love story between the two of them, perhaps this long felt and never consummated attraction that went back to their childhood in slavery together. Maybe they had broken each other's hearts by marrying other people, but eventually found themselves free. And as Susan wrote in her affidavit, she said, we, Frank Laws and I, married right in the dining room of Captain McCabe's house. And when I read that, I was just kind of blown away to read that they were married December 21st, 1867. I'm sorry, December 12th, 1867, right in my dining room. That's still the dining room of my house today, which I'm actually now using as my office. That dining room table is now my desk in COVID times. And so this love story played itself out right under my own roof. But their love story soon grew more tragic. Frank and Susan Laws kept living with the McCabes until the late 1870s, when the old captain died, at which they moved to Baltimore and sank into deep poverty. Frank had never recovered from the illness that he contracted in the Union Army hospitals. He actually declined to the point where he was completely bedridden, with Susan barely supporting them by washing and ironing clothes. until he finally died in April 1884, nearly 20 years after he had entered the Union Army. Susan would describe his fatal illness as a heavy cold from which he never recovered and died. She also described him as suffering a sort of a progressive paralysis, which culminated in total paralysis before he finally succumbed to his illness. And she wrote that of the 6 children that they had together, none survived infancy. In Susan's poignant words, "I was never able to raise any of them." Now, I'm not a doctor, but I believe that the lingering illness that Frank contracted in the war was obviously more than just a heavy cold. But I think, and based on conversations I've had with friends who are doctors, that it was chronic tuberculosis, which was widespread in Civil War hospitals and which can linger for decades. It was very difficult for doctors to diagnose, but it would have included recurrent cold-like coughing and hacking, and it can also cause progressive neurological degeneration leading to paralysis. It is very dangerously contagious, and of course it's especially lethal for infants and small children, especially if they're impoverished African-American children with little or any access to professional medical care, as these children probably were. So really not only was Frank Laws a victim of the Civil War, a sacrifice to the cause of the Union in the Civil War, but so were the lives of his 6 small children as well. Really, when we count the bloodshed, the carnage of the Civil War, I think we should count not only those who fell on the battlefield, but people like Frank Laws and people like his family. When Susan was left a widow, she was left perhaps in circumstances even more dire than when Frank was alive, or just as dire as when Frank was alive. When she applied for her pension 7 years later, her entire personal property was assessed as follows. The document simply says her wearing apparel. So she literally just possessed nothing but the clothes on her back. She eventually, after long back and forth with the federal government, received her government pension of $8 a month. And it may have literally been a lifesaver for her given her level of destitution. She lived another decade and a half and died in Baltimore on May 1st, 1908 at the age of 72. This is the document that closes out her pension file. This story of Frank and Susan, and when I look and think about her getting her $8 a month, compared to the several $100s that Captain McCabe had gotten simply for having enslaved her husband and then set him free to join the Union Army. If you talk about reparations, if you talk about the not just humanitarian, but huge financial crime and robbery that slavery represented, and that continued in this case into the 20th century, and whose repercussions are felt today, I think you can't get much more dramatic than this. So I think about Frank and Susan often when I'm standing next to the fireplace in my dining room. I imagine them standing there by the mantle tying the knot in December of 1867. When I'm looking at the stairs that go up to the attic, where I believe the enslaved people lived in my house, stairs that, as you can see, are worn down by the passage of many, many feet over the years. I think about them as well. And I think about the way that I inhabit this same house that they inhabited, a house that in many ways also metaphorically all of us still inhabit, that house divided from 1861 to 1865, that house that was reunited at the end of the Civil War perhaps, but in many ways is still a house divided today that we live in. So I'll end with that, having gone on a little bit longer than I meant to, and take any comments and questions that people may have. So does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts? If you want to write something in chat, you can write something in chat, or you can speak up.
I have a question right here.
Yeah.
Adam, I
Hi,
love
Leslie.
her so much. I too know the house, of course, having visited you, and we are familiar with some other houses around here. We know each one has a fabulous story. So that just inspires me to keep looking for my stories as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. And Leslie Raymond, for those of you who don't know her, is an incredible historian and arts impresario and pillar of the community in Kent County, who was one of the first people I got to know when I came to the Eastern Shore in 2002, introduced by Ted Widmer, who's also here tonight. And really, Leslie has done so much to inform and inspire my love and knowledge of history, particularly African-American history on the Eastern Shore. Did a lot, along with others who are here tonight, to help save Sumner Hall in Chestertown. So thanks, Leslie. It means a lot that you're here.
That's great. Thanks.
Adam, I have a question here. I've temporarily loaned out my book, 1861, but did you have McCabe in that book?
I do not. No, I do not. I have a little bit about Major Emery in that book, although less of his story than I've told tonight. I think I'm going to have the story of Frank and Susan Laws in the book that I'm writing right now, which is 1865. I actually have them early in that book in the manuscript that I'm working on now.
Can't wait.
I have a question about a little further down the Eastern Shore.
Sure.
Have you done any research or with Camp Upton in Salisbury and the protection of the rail and telegraph line that ran down the peninsula?
I have not, and I have a feeling that you might know more about it than I do. If you want to tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, it would all be circumstantial, but it's a Union fort in Salisbury called Camp Upton, and I've always understood that the purpose of it was to guard the rail and telegraph line, which was the telegraph line from Washington, D.C. up through Wilmington and then down eventually to Fort Monroe, which never fell.
Interesting.
And I have memories in my family of Union soldiers raiding the farm and taking all the food and that sort of stuff. But that's all that I know.
Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. My name is Clay Washington. I'm with the Kennard African American Cultural Heritage Center in Centerville, and we're always looking for good pieces regarding African American heritage for our small museum that we're putting together. And I would like to communicate with you a little bit more about the story of Frank and Sarah Laws. So because that might make a good piece, because they were from Queen Anne's County, which is where we were.
I would love to talk with you about them, and congratulations on the success of the Kennard School Museum. And for those of you on this call who haven't visited there yet, I very much encourage you to do so. The community in Centerville has come together to save a treasure of local African American history where those stories can be told. So I definitely would encourage you to visit, and I'd be happy to be in touch with you, Clay, about sharing their story. I think it's stories like Frank and Susan's that really need to be known when people talk about the Civil War.
Okay, well, I'll find a way to get a hold of you.
Yeah, you can find me through the Washington College website. If you just Google my name, a page will come up with my email address pretty quickly.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
Adam, this is Carol Niemand. I've lost you on the screen, but I have been down to Spaniard's Neck and seen some of the old houses down there. I wanted to know, how is it that you acquired the house you're living in, and how do you feel? Do you feel especially fortunate living in that house? I mean, I think there must have been a confluence of circumstances. How did you get to that house?
Wow.
I'm curious.
Without getting too deep into my real estate history,
Okay.
anybody who's on this session who lives in or has lived in an old house knows it's both a blessing and a curse. I always tell people that I just hold up the roof with one hand and write checks with the other. I'm seeing a few of my friends on this call actually for whom I know that this rings true. So it's a lot of work to live in a house like that. I also love it. I love the stories. I always tell my students that all of these old houses on the Eastern Shore are not just sort of charming, quaint, I hate that word, quaint looking buildings, but they're also containers of stories, containers of ghosts that you can you can discover if you are persistent and curious enough. So getting to know those ghosts in my house has been an adventure of the past 17 years, and one that I feel extraordinarily blessed. And I feel, I don't know if I'm a believer in the supernatural or not, but I am a believer that when people like Frank and Susan are ready to have their stories told, they sort of come out and start speaking them in their own time. So I feel grateful to Frank and Susan for entrusting their stories to me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Adam, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of yours. I've got your signed autographed book right here with me. But I realize that 1861 was about the whole year and about the entire country. But the question I have for you was with respect to the man who wrote the Talbot County history, Dixon Preston.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with him?
I am. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in his version of the 1861 in Talbot County, he talked about where right immediately after all the excitement of the Baltimore riot, a group of essential secessionists, slave owners in Easton, essentially declared martial law in the county, and essentially told everybody, go home, close the stores, and this is now a Confederate area. And I think that's why the Union troops showed up because there are an awful lot of, they were a minority. There were more Unionists in the county, and I'm sure they complained long and loud to the other people, in either Baltimore or Washington that, the county had been commandeered. And I think that it was Judge Carmichael who was giving the secessionists their essential legality of their martial law being declared. Isn't that a cause for them to come? There was certainly a stupid thing to beat the man up, but on the other hand, there was it seems to me, a reasonable rationale for coming and arresting him.
Well,
and
yeah, there was a
like
lot
General Tillman.
Yeah, there was a lot of pro-secessionist activity going on up and down the Eastern Shore in 1861 and later as well, but particularly 1861. There were local militia groups that were forming and drilling more or less openly until they were driven underground, people who were gathering arms and ammunition. The specific incident that Judge Carmichael was referring to had to do also with the November 1861 elections that were being held locally. And federal authorities didn't want secessionists to be prevailing in those elections. So they came around arresting secessionist leaders to keep them from stirring up the secessionists to vote in that election. That's something that they did repeatedly, basically every November throughout the Civil War. And so I think with that specific charge to the grand jury, that was what Carmichael had sort of foremost in his mind when he issued that charge to the jurors.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, like you, I guess I feel sorry for Carmichael getting beaten bloody with the butts of the revolvers, but my heart isn't really breaking for him too much, I gotta say.
Well, it seemed to me that part of the problem here what was that the secessionists essentially were the wealthier people, better educated, as was the case in most of the South. It was the planter class that basically took over. And, in the absence of a lot of newspapers and news media, they were the media for the average poor people who they essentially, drove into secession through fear of abolition.
Yeah, certainly Carmichael was part of that elite planter class that was more likely to be secessionist than others in Maryland. But I don't think it's fair to say that it was simply a class issue, because there were a great many poor whites on the Eastern Shore who were quite invested, if not in slavery itself, at least in the system of white supremacy, of which slavery was seen as the cornerstone. And so I think, we sometimes think that of the Civil War as being a war over slavery. I think it's actually more accurate to say that it was a war over white supremacy.
I think that's fair to say, considering in Maryland, half the slaves in the state were already free. Half the blacks state were already free, and I think that caused a lot of confusion. I felt like an awful lot of the poor folks who were white supremacists especially feared abolition because they were not for equality.
That's right. I have a question. Is there more information on the end stories of the Emery sons? Did they return to the area after the war? How did the family deal with the post-war era? So that, first of all, Emery himself, William Hemsley Emery himself, stayed in the Union Army, stayed in the United States Army, had a distinguished career in the Army, which he retired from in the 1870s. At least a couple of his children stayed in military careers as well. I don't know a lot about what happened with those family relationships that may or may not have been frayed by the war. I get the sense that there were some lasting rifts. His brother, as I said, the one who really went off and was a Confederate dead ender, ended up dying alone in a Confederate nursing home in total poverty, and I have the sense was estranged from the rest of the family. But I've got to say, I think the story of the Emerys in the war is kind of a book that's waiting to be written. And since I probably won't have time to write it myself, I would urge any of the people on this call to write that book, because there's just so much there, and there are papers that I haven't looked at of the Emerys that are at University of Maryland, that are in the National Archives, Library of Congress. There's just so much there, and you could really tell an American Civil War saga just through that Emery family. So it's a book that I probably won't write, but hope I will read. A comment from Sheila Austrian, my wonderful former student. In her book Cast, Isabel Wilkerson uses buying an old house as a metaphor for assuming some responsibility for the history it contains or represents. It seems your Centerville home had that effect on you. Thanks for this talk. That's really beautiful. And I've read Isabel Wilkerson's book on the Great Migration, but I haven't read her recent book Cast yet, and that certainly gives me a reason to. She's a beautiful writer, and that's a beautiful idea. I'm just looking to see if there are other questions in the comments, and I am not seeing any there, but does anybody have any comment that they want or question they want to speak up about? Oh, there's James. Hello, James.
Hey, Adam.
Poplar Grove.
Thank you for your talk. I, of course, really grateful for everything you've helped us with. And I guess that's sort of my question is, what advice do you have about preserving the history that you do stumble across and then interweaving it, as you learn more? Because it seems like it's always a moving target. Almost the more I learn, the less I know, sometimes I feel.
James, thanks. And thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know him, James Wood is a 13th generation descendant of the owners of Poplar Grove. He's I don't remember how many greats nephew of Major William Hemsley Emery, who we just heard about. And he, for the past 20 years, has been the owner and steward of Poplar Grove, and just putting in tremendous work to preserve and save that incredibly important property, as well as the papers in it, which he and his family put on long-term deposit at the Maryland State Archives. So James, I guess the best that I could say is that I hope that other people will take an example from you, and when they find these kinds of family papers in the attic or in the basement, we'll make sure that they end up in a public repository where historians can make use of them and where they can be preserved, and that people will just do their best to collect what history they can, not just documentary history, but oral history as well. And both of your parents gave us some really, who are now no longer with us, wonderful, dear friends of mine, left some beautiful oral histories, family oral histories as well. So I guess that would be my advice. And can you tell us what's going on now with the preservation of Poplar Grove? Because I know it's a challenging property. Speaking of old houses, yours is more challenging and larger than mine by a factor of 10, it seems like.
Well, the really incredible thing is my oldest daughter, Olivia, and her husband, Eric, have visions of restoring it. I mean, I've sort of been just trying to keep it literally, just put a roof on it 2 years ago, and water was coming in the house in some parts. It wasn't, but so it's a huge project, and but they've got the energy and vision, and so that's really exciting, and to have them be a neighbor is a joy. And Olivia was working with you as an intern on the papers project, so she's got the bug, and I think we're also interested in the African American component and all the tangents of that, and we've got some preliminary thoughts on that, and would love to work with on that as well. But it's just there's so many different things that you can only bite off one at a time, whether it's the house or the history, and so it's a work in progress all the time, it feels to me.
Yeah, and the African American history of Poplar Grove is something that has really been studied even less than the Emery family history. And I think it's important when we think about these Eastern Shore plantations or farms, and they didn't use the word plantation all that much on the Eastern Shore. Sometimes, I think they actually did sometimes with the Emerys and the Carmichaels. But when we think about those communities, they really were communities in which a majority of the inhabitants were African Americans. And all too often, the African Americans part of the story is left subordinate to the white families part of the story. And so the story of those communities at Poplar Grove and elsewhere is just waiting to be unearthed and told everywhere. And the idea that those stories are totally lost and impossible to document is just completely untrue, as I think the records of Poplar Grove will show. Anybody who's interested in learning more about Poplar Grove, there's actually going to be an event, funnily enough, a week from tonight. Is a week from tonight, or is it on the, well, it's one night next week. Now I'm forgetting which night exactly it is, but one night next week, River Arts in Chestertown, which is run by Mariah Wood, the niece of James Wood, another descendant of the Emery family. They're hosting a roundtable discussion on Poplar Grove and the Poplar Grove papers. And James's daughter, Olivia, whom he mentioned, and I are participating, and other family members and some of my former students are participating as well. So if you want to hear more about that story and that amazing collection of papers, if you Google River Arts Chestertown, you'll find the link to sign up for that session next week. Great. Well, maybe we have time for one more question or comment before we adjourn.
One more thing, Adam.
Yeah, Bob.
We just did my grandparents' house that was built here in 1911. And I've got 2 large metal strongbox containers you might want to look at, that letters going way back into the 1800s.
Wow. Okay. I'll be right over. Let me log off and be right over. What's your address? Seriously though, Bob, thank you. And let's be in touch by email right away. I really appreciate that. And to everybody on this call, first of all, I see so many people who are involved in historic preservation and the history of the Eastern Shore in so many ways, whether through research or through houses and structures that they've preserved. Thanks to all of you. I feel so blessed to be part of a community that cares about history as much as all of you do, especially those of you working on African American history. I see my colleague Jason Patterson, who, if you haven't seen his work, just opened a couple of weeks ago an extraordinary exhibition through Washington College's website on the African American history of Kent County. And Washington College in particular. I would urge you to go and view that virtual exhibition online. So anyway, thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing that's so inspiring. Please be in touch with me if you have history that the Starr Center should know about, especially African American history from the Eastern Shore. We would love to know about it. And I hope to see all of you at Starr Center events actually face-to-face soon. So stay well, stay safe, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating tonight. And the recording will be on the oxfordccu.org website shortly. Thank you, Adam. Such a great talk, such an incredible evening. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Liza.
Bye, everybody.
Adam, I'm going to give you a watch.
What's that?
I said, I'm going to give you a watch. I'm only kidding. I loved you going way over time.
I always end up going way over time. I can't help it. I start talking.
It was wonderful. I would not want it
Thanks,
to be
Jenny.
30 minutes.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Oh.